Recently, 11 Russian soldiers were killed by Ukrainian forces as they laid on their stomachs in surrender. The incident was partially videotaped by Ukrainian soldiers. The video shows one Ukrainian gunner on his stomach with his weapon pointed at the Russian soldiers laying down in surrender, and a few other Ukrainian soldiers were walking around with their guns relatively at rest. Suddenly, what looks to be a Russian soldier comes out behind a shed and begins firing. The video ends. Now, what's then seen is the aftermath. The 10 unarmed Russian soldiers who were seen moving and alive are now dead, laying in a pool of blood, as well as the soldier who came out firing. And the incident is now under investigation by the UN. Now, the question is, was this a war crime that violates the Geneva Conventions, or were these surrendered unarmed soldiers killed in the crossfire? A former attorney general with Ukraine stated that the soldiers may have been killed after one opened fire on the Ukrainian soldiers, making it a crime of parody or false surrender. But many others believe these soldiers were killed in an act of vengeance. Here to help us sort out the latest on this horrific event is Dan Kovalik, live from a recent visit in the Donbass region and Moscow, who teaches at the International Human Rights School at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law and is the author of several books, including The Plot to Scapegoat Russia. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So I'm sure you've seen the video many times. I watched it many times trying to figure it out. I know a lot of people are trying to figure out what exactly happened. What is your take from what you've seen?
Well, I'm pretty confident that this was a war crime, that these Russian soldiers were killed in cold blood after surrendering. And honestly, this wouldn't be the first time during this conflict that this has happened, or even, in the last 8 years. We have to recall that this conflict between the government in Kiev and the people of this region in eastern Ukraine has been going on for 8 years, and numerous, war crimes have been carried out during that time.
So, how do you think it happened? I mean, what are you thinking? Because we don't know what happened after what looks to be the Russian soldier comes out and fires at the Ukrainians. We don't really see what happens, but, the video cuts out and then we suddenly see the aftermath, the gruesome aftermath. So there was one gunner that was on the ground with he seemed to be the only one that had his weapon engaged or, pointed anywhere. The others were kind of walking around more casually. So is it possible that they were killed in the crossfire, that maybe that gunman started firing at the Russian that came out, and then these ones that were laying on the ground happened to be in the line of fire? Do you think that's a possibility, or do you think, it's still really unclear, or do you think they were killed maybe point blank one by one after this whole incident happened?
I think so. I think it's unlikely that, that many soldiers are going to be killed in crossfire between two different people.
Yeah.
Right. It seems like something out of, either, a comedy or something where, one bullet kills 10 people. I don't see it as possible. And the fact that one person might have tried to fire on a Ukrainian soldier would not justify that soldier or others killing the other ones that are there who weren't firing. So, no. And again, we know that this has been happening, that the Ukrainian forces actually have killed a number of Russian soldiers in cold blood. There's a lot of evidence of that. Have wounded and killed and tortured Russian POWs and also civilians. So, as a lawyer, when you look at a criminal case, you also look at patterns, right? You look at the patterns of conduct that people carry out. And again, this would be in keeping with what frankly, Ukraine's forces have done in the past. And by the way, I'll just say my guess is the Russian soldier who might have fired knew that was going to happen. That is to say, he knew what was coming next, that they would have been killed anyway, right? Because this is par for the course.
Yeah, so you've been following a lot of these war crimes that are being committed. What we're seeing in the media is really just, we're only hearing about Russian war crimes against Ukrainians. We rarely hear about Ukrainian war crimes against the Russians. When they admit that there are actually war crimes, and I believe both sides commit war crimes. I think war is ugly. I don't think there is a
Yeah.
good side. Both sides are bad when it comes to war. I think that's just really kind of the way it is. In all wars, we might agree with one side more than the other of why the war is happening. But at the end of the day, war itself, when you're in the heat of the battle, you've got young people being called up to go and fight for their countries, whether they agree with their country or not. And I think war is a terrible, treacherous thing. But what we hear about a lot, of course, is that Russia does all of the war crimes. Ukraine does none of them. Then when we saw, well, there's evidence of Ukraine doing war crimes, then the media kind of says, well, okay, they do some war crimes, but not nearly to the level that the Russians are doing war crimes. I mean, do you think that that's believable? Is it that the Russians are just that much more evil than the Ukrainians, that they're committing way more war crimes than the Ukrainians? Or do you think it's probably equal or more so on the Ukrainian side?
Yeah, well, I think, depending on the situation, it's at least equal. But, my hunch is that the Ukrainians probably carry out more. And again, I have to stress the fact that this conflict has been going on for 8 years before the Russians even entered the theater, right? Between the government in Kiev and their own people in the Donbass region, okay?
Right.
And in that course of that war, the government of Kiev and its military and its Azov battalion allies have committed many war crimes. 14,000 people were killed even before Russia invaded in February. And again, a lot of the conduct carried out by the Ukrainian forces have amounted to war crimes. By the way, when I was in Donetsk, which is in the Donbass region, I guess a little over a week ago, I witnessed myself war crimes being committed. The forces of the Ukrainian military, they were shooting over the front lines into Donetsk city, a civilian city. They fired at a school. They hit a school. They hit the soccer stadium. They hit another place where people go get water. Because, by the way, there's not much water there because in the past, the Ukrainian military had destroyed the water filtration system in Donetsk. All those things are war crimes. They're, shooting over the front lines to hit civilian targets. So
Yeah.
this is part, and I met people who, by the way, were held in captivity by Ukrainian forces and tortured. And again, all of this has been well documented. So,
Yeah.
and as you say, I think what you say is an apt point. And I want to echo that. The main crime that the justices at Nuremberg wanted to stop and prevent, and that the UN Charter wants to prevent, is war itself. Because what the justices at Nuremberg, realize is that once war starts, war crimes happen. Right? I mean,
Right.
you don't have a war without war crimes. It's just a fact. And so, yeah, I'm certain both sides are committing them. But as you say, the Western media is focusing entirely on Russia's.
Yeah, I mean, it's just all Russia bad. Ukraine never does anything, and Russia's doing all of the war crimes. And I think, from a logical perspective, I think it's plausible that Ukraine would commit more of the war crimes simply because typically war crimes happen because of anger, right? Like you're emotionally charged up, more emotionally charged up, and so willing to commit more atrocities because you're so angry or wanting to get vengeance. That's when war crimes happen. And I think it makes more sense logically. I mean, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but logically, Ukrainians would feel more, I would imagine because of the invasion of Russia into their country, that they would have more reason to feel angry, and they would have more reason to feel like, I'm going to get you, kind of, that sort of mentality. Whereas I don't know if the Russians coming in are thinking, oh, we're going to get you. I think it's, if I'm just to play it out of my mind of logically, which one would I think would be committing more war crimes, I would think that Ukrainians would have more reason to commit acts of vengeance and to go after Russian soldiers than the other way around. But it's probably more equal than not in this situation between the two. Just atrocious and terrible. So let's talk about your time that you were there in the Donbass region. There's the narrative going around right now also that when that Russia annexing those regions, that these people were forced into it. They don't want to be part of Russia, that the vote was a sham. What was the sentiment you got from the people while you were there? The Ukrainian people living in these regions, what is their take on the war and Russia coming into the country, them being part of Russia? What was the sentiment you witnessed?
Right. So first of all, I was in the Donetsk Republic, and that's my stay was entirely there. So I can only speak to Donetsk. That's a significant part of that area. But I did travel from the far east to the far west of Donetsk. So I saw a lot of Donetsk while I was there. And I look, I'll be honest. I can assure you the people there want to be part of Russia at this point. They've been attacked for 8 years, shelled constantly by Ukraine, continue to be shelled, and they do not feel confident that the government in Kiev has their best interest at heart, to say the least.
Yeah.
And let me say that since the referendum in September, in which the people of Donetsk voted to join Russia, what I was told is that things have improved greatly. That is to say that people feel more optimistic. There was traffic on the street. People were going to restaurants. People were going to stores. I went to restaurants, saw very vibrant restaurants and stores. I mean, meaning that life is continuing there. And I think, frankly, improving since the Russians came in. I mean, because the government in Kiev was treating those people brutally. And that is just a fact. Moreover, I saw things that is not being discussed in the Western media, like the fact that Russia is actually engaged in reconstruction. In Donetsk, I saw a state-of-the-art hospital that Russia has built in the last 3.5 months. I saw a massive housing project that's going to house about 4,000 people that it's been put up in the last 3.5 months by Russia. So this idea that Russia just came in and occupied people who didn't want to be occupied, I don't think it's true. I'm confident that that is not true. Now, when you talk about Kiev and Western Ukraine, that's different. Right. I don't think those folks want anything to do with Russia. That's very clear. But I think when you talk about this region, the Donbass region, I'm confident that those folks certainly don't want to be part of Ukraine. And by the way, people should be reminded of the fact that even before the referendums in September this year, there were referendums in 2014 in which Donetsk and its neighboring Luhansk voted to be autonomous from Ukraine for the reasons that I mentioned. So, I think people need to wake up to the fact that in eastern Ukraine, they want nothing to do anymore with the government in Kiev.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point that a lot of people are, especially all the people in Western media that keep talking about democracy and protecting democracy and championing democracy. And then when you say, well, the people, what about what the people want? And they say, oh, screw what the people want. And it's like, well, isn't that democracy? I mean, if we're going to champion democracy and if we're going to even hail Ukraine as this, this pillar of democracy in that region in Eastern Europe, if we're going to even make those claims, then wouldn't we say the people in those regions should have a choice on what they want? Because that is what democracy is fundamentally, right? But it's interesting that that it doesn't seem to matter. It's like with the people in Crimea. It doesn't matter what they want. Who cares what they want? That's what people say. It's just, oh no, they're part of Ukraine, and to hell with them if they want to be part of Russia. They don't get to be. They have to go back to being part of Ukraine. It just makes no sense if we're saying we're champions for democracy. It's just one of those things.
Well, yeah. In fact, what Russia points out is the fact that if you look at the situation, it's actually better in this situation to argue for the right of those people to join Russia than it was for Kosovo to become independent from Serbia, which the U.S. pushed for and even got, and that happened without any referendum, you might recall. And they even went to the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, for an advisory opinion, and that court ruled that it was appropriate for Kosovo to be a sovereign entity from Serbia. And Russia's saying, well, guys, you pushed for the Kosovo to be independent, but you don't want these folks to either be independent or be part of Russia, even with referendums. So, as you say, there's many double standards that are being applied here.
Yeah. So in your book, The Plot to Scapegoat Russia, I'm just curious, you've written this book Is there a why do you think just why do you think Russia has been deemed as the big bad enemy for the United States? I mean, even when Russia was asking to be more part of the West, Russia's asked to be part of NATO, Russia's asked to be part of Europe, having to really join the EU and be part of the European Union. And what I don't know if have they asked to be part of the European Union? Am I wrong on that?
They asked to be part of NATO, and
Certainly
that was
NATO.
rejected. I don't think part of EU.
Yeah,
No.
but they've certainly asked to be more involved in Europe and be really considered more of a European, especially Moscow, a European city,
Absolutely.
for sure. So why do you think we have then just said, forget it, we don't care, we're just demonizing you no matter what?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. By the way, just to point out the notion that Russia wants to be part of the West, I was surprised that almost all the menus in Russia had English, subtitles. And I went to an opera, and they even had English subtitles over the stage. The point is, they're very pro-Western. They want to be part of
Right.
the West. And you're right, we've rejected them. Why have we rejected them? I think there's a number of reasons. I think some of it's, anti-Slavic racism. You can go back to Napoleon Bonaparte, who invaded Russia. The Nazis invaded Russia, believing the Slavs to be, undermentioned. And by the way, the West stood by and allowed that to happen and didn't open up a Western front for 3 years while that war was going on. I think that's part of it. I think also the U.S. frankly just needs an enemy to justify, nearly $1 trillion of military aid a year. And
Right.
Russia has been a very convenient enemy because of the Cold War and the Soviet Union. And people still conflate the Soviet Union with Russia, right? Even though it collapsed in 1991, it's an easy foil, right? We still have movies being made where the Soviets or Russians are the bad guys. And so, again, I think it's a convenient enemy. And I think that the third reason is because the U.S., after the collapse of the Soviet Union, wanted to be and expected to be the sole superpower. And so any country that contests that role, whether it be Russia or China, is deemed an enemy.
Yeah.
And as Russia got back on its feet, the U.S. decided that it didn't want it back on its feet. It didn't want it as a rival. And I think that's a big reason as well. By the way, it doesn't want Germany as a rival either, and it has made sure it won't be by denying them gas from Russia,
Yeah.
which has fed Western Europe even during the times of the Soviet
I'm
Union.
glad you brought them up because I was just about to say Germany's next. The writing is on the wall. And I know a lot of people they're not looking ahead to this, but if you do look ahead and you see, okay, Russia and China for sure, we already see that right now. Germany is next. They are rising again. And they certainly are next to be demonized because what will eventually happen is they will say, no, look, we can't reject Russia anymore. We need them. They will continue to build. They will continue to grow. And it's just a matter of time before Germany is also viewed as another one of the enemies on the list. I'm pretty sure of it.
Well, and again, I think, in fact, the deed has been done by, they are going to have a horrible winter. A lot of their industries are going to shut down because of this. Again, so the sanctions against Russia were aimed as much against Germany as against Russia. And that's very clear.
Yeah.
And so they don't even need to be demonized per se because we're going to wreck their economy regardless.
Well,
So,
but then they will be because they're going to rise up against that. They're going to say we can't have a wrecked economy. They're going to start making different moves and different choices. And once again, they'll be on the list, the shit list for the U.S. So, Dan, great chatting with you. Thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik, and I've been posting a lot about my trip to Donetsk. And they can find my books on Amazon and at skyhorsepublishing.com.
Excellent. The Plot to Scapegoat Russia. Dan Kovalik, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.